It was a brand new futuristic pleasure dome, built on the seafront in Douglas on the Isle of Man. What better way to spend a rainy day than stepping into somewhere warm, somewhere bright, somewhere designed so that the weather could never ruin your time away again. Inside it felt like summer. The artificial sun warmed the air as families drifted between pools and cafes. Everything was contained within this carefully controlled subtropical world. It was exciting. It was unlike anything people had seen before. And for a while it was loved. But the warmth they came for would not be the warmth that followed. Outside, just beyond the walls of that artificial paradise, something had already gone wrong. Near the miniature golf course on one of the terraces stood a small kiosk that was used to store brochures. It was here at around 7:30 p.m. on August the 2nd, 1973, that three boys had slipped away, drawn by the familiar thrill of doing something they weren't supposed to. They had brought a cigarette with them. Where they got it from, who knows? At that age, it could have come from anywhere. One of them struck a match, and for a moment it was nothing more than a small flame catching where it shouldn't, the sort of thing that could easily have been stamped out and forgotten. One of the boys would later say they did try to put it out, but it spread too quickly, the heat rising faster than they expected. Panic followed, and the instinct was simply to get away, and so they ran. Behind them, the kiosk began to burn, the flames taking hold of the structure and growing steadily. Inside Summerland, the evening continued. Music drifted out from the marquee show bar. Cocktails were poured into plastic coconuts on the garden terrace, and although a few noticed smoke rising outside, it drew little more than curiosity. Staff were alerted and came to investigate, and what they saw seemed to confirm what they already believed, that this was a minor external fire, something that could be dealt with using the equipment on hand without causing alarm. There was no immediate call to the fire brigade, and no reason in their minds to interrupt the thousands of people inside who were enjoying their evening. People were told there was nothing to worry about. In some areas, announcements suggested the situation was under control, and even as smoke became more visible from outside the complex, the response within the building remained measured, contained, and critically delayed. What no one inside could see was what the fire had already found. As the kiosk burned against the outer wall, the flames began to affect the materials that formed Summerland's exterior, softening them, allowing heat and fire to pass through into the narrow cavity between the outer shell and inner walls. It was a space that had never been intended to be seen, let alone fought, and once the fire entered it, it began to move in ways that no one outside could track. It travelled upward, spreading behind the walls and feeding on the materials within that hidden space, growing in intensity while remaining almost entirely invisible to those inside the building. By the time the first traces of smoke began to drift through the vents and into the interior, the fire had already taken hold inside the building. And what made that moment so dangerous was the building itself. Summerland had opened just 2 years earlier in 1971, conceived as something entirely new. A vast indoor leisure complex built into the hillside above Douglas Bay, where thousands of visitors could move freely between pools, terraces, bars and amusements without ever stepping outside. It had been developed by James Hartford and designed by architect Douglas Stephen, and at the time it was seen as a bold, forward-thinking answer to a growing problem. By the late 1960s, British seaside tourism was beginning to struggle, with more and more holidaymakers choosing cheaper, sunnier destinations abroad. Summerland was built as an answer to that. It was a climatically controlled indoor leisure space where the temperature never dipped below 80 degrees, no matter what the weather was doing outside. It was a multi-million-pound development, ambitious in both scale and design, intended to draw people back and keep them there. But this wasn't just a leisure centre, it was an entire environment, built to feel like somewhere else entirely. Spread across more than 7 levels and covering a 3.5-acre site, Summerland offered a version of paradise that had been carefully constructed piece by piece. There were heated indoor pools and saunas, a fun fair, a roller skating rink, restaurants and bars, children's theatre, and even an underground disco tucked away beneath it all. Higher up, the solarium, sometimes called the sun dome, allowed visitors to lie beneath the light, letting them feel as if they were somewhere far warmer than the Isle of Man. Everywhere you looked, the illusion was reinforced with colour. Plastic palm trees lined walkways. Artificial rock features and decorative facades gave the impression of something natural, something exotic. There were fake waterfalls softly cascading through the space, and bright synthetic colours designed to suggest sunlight even when there was none. It was a tropical world recreated in plastic and steel. There had even been plans to bring it to life with real birds to let them move freely through the space, adding to the illusion. They experimented with the idea, but the reality didn't quite work. Birds pecked at the artificial foliage, and some became ill as a result, so the idea was scrapped. Although a chicken, known affectionately by visitors as Henrietta, wandered the complex, jumping on tables, pinching a few crumbs here and there. It was strange, slightly surreal, and the people inside loved it. But it was what surrounded that space that mattered most. Much of the building was clad in translucent acrylic panels made from a material known as auroglass, very similar to perspex. It was chosen because it was lightweight, strong, and capable of letting light flood into the interior while keeping the warmth inside. It gave Summerland its distinctive appearance, that glowing, almost futuristic look that made it feel unlike anything else. It also meant the building behaved very differently under fire. Behind those panels were layers of composite materials and internal finishes, arranged in a way that had never truly been tested under the conditions that were now developing. In the area where the fire first took hold, part of the outer wall was faced with a material called galbestos, profiled steel sheeting with asbestos felt on both sides, coated with bitumen and with no real fire-resistant qualities. It was used as a substitute for reinforced concrete in order to reduce costs and make it quicker to construct. Within parts of the structure were more combustible internal finishes too, including decalin, a plastic-coated fiberboard used on interior wall surfaces. The design allowed for large open spaces, but offered very little in the way of containment. The terraces and open internal voids gave heat and smoke room to rise freely, and once fire entered the hidden spaces between the outer and inner walls, those unblocked internal areas began to act almost like chimneys, drawing flames upwards, feeding them with air, and helping the fire spread through the building far faster than anyone inside realized. And there had already been a warning. Just a year earlier, in 1972, a fire had broken out within the complex. It was contained quickly, repairs were made, and the building reopened. Officially, everything was still considered safe. But questions had been raised about how materials like auroglass would react to heat, about how fire might travel through the structure, and about whether the open design could allow it to spread faster than expected. Those questions were never fully answered. And on the evening of August 2nd, 1973, with around 3,000 people inside, Summerland was open as usual, unaware that it was about to face the very scenario it had already hinted at once before. The moment it revealed itself, it did so all at once. There was no gradual escalation, no clear warning that allowed people time to process what was happening. One moment there was uncertainty, smoke, questions, reassurance, and the next, flames broke through into the main body of the building. They appeared along the rear wall of the arcade, forcing their way out from beyond the panels and racing upwards towards the ceiling, moving with a speed that seemed impossible to comprehend. Within seconds, the fire had spread. One survivor would later recall, it was as if the whole place had been doused in petrol. It just went up. It moved across the ceiling, feeding on decorations, fittings, and anything else it could reach, while above, the structure itself began to fail. The acrylic panels that had once filled the space with light now softened and ignited, dripping molten material down into the areas below, setting fire to whatever it touched. People would later describe it as plastic raining down, burning as it fell. And in the years that followed, the material would earn an even darker name, horror glass. As the fire spread, the atmosphere changed rapidly. Smoke thickened, heat intensified, and visibility began to fall away, turning familiar spaces into something unrecognizable. The open design that had once made movement feel easy now worked against them, allowing smoke and heat to travel just as freely as people had. There was no alarm to guide them. In the control booth, the operator responsible for triggering it hesitated. There was no clear indication on the panel that anything was wrong. The system itself had known issues, having been interfered with in the past to prevent false alarms, and in that moment it failed to do the one thing it was there for. Then the crowd began to move, not in one direction but in many. Some headed for exits they remembered, others followed the movement of those around them. Parents turned back, searching for children they had lost moments earlier. The building filled with urgency, noise and confusion. Then, suddenly, the lights went out. Amid the chaos, power to the building had been cut, a decision made in the belief that it might reduce the risk of an electrical fire. Instead, it plunged large areas into darkness, and emergency lighting failed to come on. And then came the realization that getting out was not going to be simple. That realization came too late for many. Summerland had exits. On paper, there were several. But in the moment, finding them and using them were two very different things. The building had never been designed for panic. It had been designed for ease, for wandering, for drifting from one space to another without ever needing to think about where you were going or how you would get back. And now suddenly, all that mattered. People moved towards the routes they knew, the ones they had used to enter or to move between levels. But those paths quickly began to fill as staircases slowed, corridors narrowed under pressure, and the people stopped moving. There were doors, but they wouldn't open, one survivor said. People were pushing, shouting, and then turning back. Some exits had been locked, a normal crowd control measure intended to prevent people from entering without paying, but now acting as barriers when escape was needed most. Some survivors would later describe emergency doors that appeared to be chained shut. Keys were supposed to be kept nearby, but often they were not immediately available, or not where people expected them to be. Some were stored in boxes that were empty, others were placed out of reach. In at least one case, an exit that might have offered a clear escape had been blocked from the outside, reportedly by a parked car, later said to belong to a member of the site's safety staff, rendering it useless when it was needed most. And so people turned back. Smoke was thickening, lowering towards the floor, forcing people to crouch, to crawl, to feel their way forward with limited visibility. The heat intensified with every passing moment, made worse by the materials overhead, which continued to melt and fall upon them. The stairways, the few that connected the upper levels to the ground, became critical to escape, but they soon went up in flames. On the upper terraces, the situation became more desperate. With routes cut off or too dangerous to use, people began to look for alternatives. Balconies, windows, any opening that might offer a way out. Below them, others gathered instinctively, arms raised, shouting for them to jump. And some did. One after another, people leapt from the upper levels. The risk of the fall was better than the certainty behind them. Some were caught, some were not. But in that moment, it was the only choice they felt they had. As more exits proved unusable, the movement of the crowd began to change. What had started as people dispersing in different directions slowly became something else, as more and more were forced back and redirected towards the same familiar way out, the main entrance. At first it was just a shift, then it became a surge. Those who reached the main doors found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of people pushing into a space that had never been intended to handle that kind of pressure. Those at the front struggled to move forward, while those behind, unaware of what lay ahead, continued to push, driven by heat, smoke, and the growing urgency to escape. The space tightened, and in that crush, people were pinned where they stood, trapped between those behind them and the doors that would not open fast enough to save them. Amid all of this, there were acts that stood out, not because they stopped the fire, nothing at that point could, but because they gave others a chance. One man soaked himself with water from an extinguisher so he could remain in the heat longer, staying behind to help others escape for as long as he was able. There was no coordination, just people doing what they could in a situation that had already gone far beyond control. Incredibly, in those crucial early moments, no one inside made the call. something that even now is difficult to understand. Those who had seen the fire believed it was small, contained. There was still no real sense of urgency about what was happening just beyond the walls. Instead, the first calls came from outside. A passing taxi driver noticed smoke rising above the complex, stopped and contacted the emergency services, while further out in Douglas Bay, the captain of a small vessel watched the glow building on the horizon and radioed it in, later describing how it looked as though the whole of the Isle of Man was on fire. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the building was already beyond saving. Flames were visible across multiple levels, smoke pouring from the structure, and the scale of what was happening was immediately clear. Crews moved in to assist with evacuation, breaking open doors, forcing entry where they could, and pulling people out of the building as quickly as possible. In some areas, what they found only confirmed how difficult escape had been. Firefighters would later report doors that had been chained and padlocked, and near those exits they encountered the consequences of that delay. People who had made it as far as the doors, but no further. As one rescuer would later recall, there were heaps of bodies near the exits, where the crush and the smoke had taken hold before escape was possible. Water was taken from wherever it could be found, from hydrants, from the swimming pools, even from the sea. But by then, suppression was no longer the priority. Rescue was. And even that was becoming more difficult by the minute. The fire had taken hold of too much, too quickly, and all that could be done was to try and reach whoever could still be saved before the building consumed itself completely. By around 9:30, it was over. What remained was a blackened shell, and inside it, the cost of everything that had gone wrong. In the hours that followed, the noise faded, leaving behind an eerie, unsettled silence. Those who had made it out stood together, trying to understand what they had just lived through, while for many, the night was far from over. Hospitals began to fill, and ambulances moved back and forth in steady rotation, carrying the injured away from the scene, while others waited for news, for confirmation that the people they had come with were still alive. Some were, many were not. And by the time the full scale of the disaster became clear, 50 people had lost their lives, with dozens more seriously injured. For a place that had been built to contain everything within its walls, the impact spread far beyond them, reaching families across the Isle of Man and beyond, each one left with the same question: how had this been allowed to happen? The answer did not come quickly. An inquiry was launched, one that would examine every stage of the building's design, construction and operation, as well as the events of that evening. It looked not only at what had happened that night, but at the decisions made long before the first spark. What it found was not a single cause. It found a pattern. Summerland had been built in phases, with different contractors and designers working on separate elements of the project, and not always in coordination with one another. The outer shell of the building had been largely completed before the internal layout was fully finalised, meaning that key safety features, including the positioning and accessibility of exits, were shaped around a structure that had already been fixed in place. That compromise mattered, because when the building was later filled with open terraces, attractions and internal divisions, the escape routes did not always align with how people actually moved through the space. Some exits were poorly positioned, others difficult to reach, and in a crisis that disconnect became critical. The materials that formed the outer walls and interior surfaces had allowed the fire to spread rapidly, both across the structure and within it. The design of the building, open and largely unrestricted, had given heat and smoke the freedom to move just as easily as the people inside. Escape routes had been insufficient, inaccessible, or unusable when they were needed most. There had been no sprinkler system. The fire alarm had failed before it could warn anyone. Staff had not been properly trained to deal with a situation like this, and when the fire began, it was not treated with the urgency it required. Each of those things on its own might not have led to disaster, but together they did. The conclusion was difficult to accept. There were no villains, no single individual held responsible for what had happened. Instead, the inquiry described a chain of human errors, assumptions made, risks underestimated, decisions taken without fully understanding their consequences, all combining over time into something far more dangerous than anyone had intended. The cost of that failure was managed not only in lives but in its aftermath. 50 people had died, dozens more had been seriously injured, and compensation claims would run into millions, reflecting the scale of loss suffered by those who survived and by the families of those who did not. Even the boys who had started the fire were seen in that context. They were found, brought before a juvenile court and given small fines, a token acknowledgement of their role. Summerland itself did not disappear immediately. It was rebuilt, redesigned with safer materials and stricter fire precautions, its open spaces reduced and its risks reconsidered. Construction began just a few years after the disaster, and by 1978 the complex had reopened. For a time, people returned, but it was never quite the same. The optimism that had once surrounded Summerland had faded, replaced by something more cautious, more uncertain, and despite efforts to revive it, the complex struggled to regain its place as a major attraction. Over the years, visitor numbers declined, and the building gradually lost the prominence it had once held. And then, decades later, it was damaged again. In 2002, torrential rain triggered landslides behind the site, dislodging massive concrete supports that had once formed part of the original structure. The damage raised serious safety concerns, and with the building already suffering from long-term structural issues, including deterioration within the concrete itself, the decision was made to close it permanently in 2004. Demolition began in 2006. Today, the building is gone. But something remains. A memorial stands bearing the names of those who did not leave that night, a quiet reminder of what happened there, and of the cost of getting it wrong. Because Summerland was not a place people feared. It was a place they trusted, a place designed to feel safe, controlled, untouched by the unpredictability of the world outside. And that is what makes its story endure. Not just the fire, or the failures, or the findings that followed, but the fact that, on that evening, thousands of people were doing something entirely ordinary. They were enjoying themselves, surrounded by warmth that had been carefully created for them. And they had no idea that for some, the sun would set there that night. Now, this awful tragedy seems to have been brought around by a chain of failures that compounded one another. Our condolences go out to the families of those who lost their lives that evening, and we hope that those that were injured made the best recovery they possibly could. Despite the nature of this tragedy, I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll say bye-bye for now.